My husband's family tradition is going to ruin our son's life. I was 8 months pregnant when my mother-in-law showed up at my house with a lawyer and a stack of documents trying to legally force me to name my unborn son Nimrod. I'd known this was coming. My husband's family had a tradition where the firstborn son in every generation for the past 400 years was named Nimrod. They even had this massive family tree in their living room with every single Nimrod going back to like the 1600s. My husband was the second son, so he got to be named Blake, which was basically winning the lottery. His older brother got stuck with Nimrod and now goes by Rod, which isn't much better, but at least people don't immediately assume his parents hate him. When I got pregnant, his family was so excited that the tradition could continue since Rod only had daughters. My father-in-law stood up with champagne and said, "To baby Nimrod." And I laughed because obviously that was a joke, but nobody else was laughing. That night I told Blake there was absolutely no way I was naming our son Nimrod. He agreed immediately and said he'd always hated the tradition and thought it was cruel to saddle a kid with that name in modern times. We decided we'd name him Charlie and just deal with his parents being upset. We thought that would be the end of it. We were so wrong. My in-laws started a full pressure campaign. They showed up at our house every single day with new reasons why we had to use the name. My father-in-law kept going on about how Nimrod was a mighty hunter in the Bible and that it was a name of strength and power, completely ignoring that nowadays everyone just thinks it means idiot. They bought hundreds of dollars worth of baby clothes and blankets and toys all monogrammed with Nimrod on them. They ordered a custom crib with Nimrod carved into the headboard. They redid their guest room as a nursery for when we'd visit and painted Nimrod's room on the door. My father-in-law sat me down and explained that he'd already added our son's name to the family trust, and legally it had to be Nimrod to qualify for inheritance. Blake's entire extended family got involved. His aunts and uncles called us constantly. His grandfather, another Nimrod, flew in from Florida to personally guilt-trip us. They had a family meeting where everyone took turns explaining why the name was important, and how we'd be destroying 400 years of tradition if we changed it. Blake's brother Nimrod even showed up and said, "Look, it sucked for me, but you get used to it and it's part of who we are." I pointed out that he literally goes by a different name and he said that was beside the point. Blake started to crack under the pressure. After weeks of constant harassment, he started saying things like, "Maybe we could use it as a middle name," or "What if we spelled it differently?" I told him that no variation of Nimrod was acceptable, and he got defensive, saying I didn't understand what it meant to his family. His parents started dangling money in front of us. They'd pay for the baby's college education, they'd give us a down payment on a bigger house, they'd set up a trust fund, but only if we used the name. Blake started looking at houses online and talking about how nice it would be to not worry about money. He started having daily phone calls with his parents that he'd taken another room. He'd come out looking stressed and wouldn't tell me what they talked about. He started saying things like, "Maybe we're being too stubborn about this," and "It's just a name. It doesn't define who he is." I reminded him that he literally said he was grateful every day that he wasn't the firstborn and didn't have to be named Nimrod. He said that was different. When I was 8.5 months pregnant, his parents showed up with a lawyer. They sat us down and presented documents they'd drawn up. They wanted us to sign a legally binding agreement that we'd name the baby Nimrod in exchange for $200,000 and a guaranteed inheritance. The lawyer explained that if we didn't sign, we'd be removed from the will entirely and cut off from the family. Blake looked at the papers and I could see him actually considering it. I stood up and told them to get out of my house. My mother-in-law started sobbing. My father-in-law said, "You're making a huge mistake." Blake didn't say anything. After they left, Blake and I had the biggest fight we'd ever had. He said I was being unreasonable and that $200,000 would change our lives. I said our son's happiness was more important than money. He said the name wasn't that bad and kids get bullied for all kinds of things. I said yes, but most parents don't deliberately choose to make their kid a target. We didn't speak for 2 days. Then I went into labor. Blake drove me to the hospital and the whole way there he kept saying, "We'll figure out the name, don't worry about it right now." Something went wrong during delivery. I started bleeding really badly and the doctors were yelling about hemorrhaging and the room filled with people. The last thing I remember was a nurse saying they needed to do an emergency transfusion. When I woke up 12 hours later, Blake was sitting next to the bed holding our son. He was crying. He handed me the birth certificate and whispered, "I'm so sorry." The name on it was Nimrod. I stared at the official state seal, the printed letters, my own signature from months ago on the pre-registration form, and then his name typed in the box where it should have said Charles. Blake kept talking, his words tumbling out about how the doctor said I might not make it. And his parents were in the waiting room and they told him it was what I would have wanted and he was so scared and he just signed everything they put in front of him. I looked up from the paper to his face, tear-streaked and desperate, and then down at the tiny person in the bassinet beside my bed who was supposed to be Charlie, but was legally something else entirely. Blake reached for my hand, but I pulled it away. I told him to get out. He started crying harder, saying we could fix it, saying he was sorry, but I just kept repeating that he needed to leave right now because I couldn't look at him. The nurse who'd been checking my blood pressure during this whole thing caught my eye and asked quietly if I needed her to enforce visitor restrictions. I nodded. Blake stood there for another few seconds like he might argue, then walked out with his shoulders shaking. The door clicked shut and I was alone with a baby whose legal name made me want to throw up, still hooked up to an IV from nearly bleeding to death 12 hours earlier. I picked him up carefully, mindful of all the tubes and wires still attached to me, and whispered that his name was Charlie no matter what any paper said. He made a small sound and I started crying. Not the pretty kind, but the ugly sobbing kind where you can't breathe right. Hours later, after I'd fed him and changed him, and just stared at his face trying to memorize every detail, a woman in scrubs knocked and introduced herself as the social worker doing evening rounds. She sat down in the chair Blake had vacated and started asking the standard questions about support at home and postpartum resources. But then she paused and looked at the chart. She asked why I kept calling the baby Charlie when all the paperwork said Nimrod. I explained the whole thing, the 400-year tradition, the pressure campaign, Blake signing while I was unconscious, and she listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said birth certificate amendments were possible but required legal process, and she could connect me with a patient advocate who specialized in these situations. She wrote down a name and extension number on a post-it note and stuck it to my bedside table, then squeezed my hand and said she'd check on me tomorrow. I was still holding that post-it note when Blake's parents showed up around 7 that evening. I heard his mother's voice in the hallway first, loud and excited, talking about a photographer and newborn pictures. The nurse from earlier, the one who'd asked about visitor restrictions, intercepted them at the door. I couldn't hear everything, but I caught phrases like approved visitors only and mother's wishes. Blake's mother started crying, that same theatrical sobbing she'd done in my living room, saying she was denied her grandson. Blake's father's voice got louder, demanding to know who gave the hospital the right to keep grandparents away. The nurse stayed calm and firm, and eventually their voices faded down the hallway. I texted Blake that his parents needed to leave the hospital entirely, or I'd call security myself. He didn't respond. Around 11 that night, Blake came back, moving quietly like he thought I might be asleep. I wasn't. I'd been lying there in the dark feeding Charlie and listening to the sounds of the hospital and trying to figure out what came next. Blake pulled the chair close to my bed and started whispering about how sorry he was, how he panicked, how the doctors were saying things like hemorrhage and transfusion, and his parents kept telling him I would have wanted the tradition honored. I whispered back that his parents clearly had paperwork ready, which meant they'd planned this and he'd chosen their pressure over everything we'd agreed on. He said he thought I was dying. I said that didn't change the fact that he'd signed away our son's identity without me. We went in circles like that for almost an hour, keeping our voices low because of the baby sleeping between us, until finally Blake left again without either of us reaching any kind of resolution. I barely slept that night. Every time I started to drift off, a nurse would come in to check vitals or bring medication, and they'd look at the chart and say something about baby Nimrod. Each time I heard it, this wave of anger and helplessness washed over me, made worse by all the postpartum hormones flooding my system. I held Charlie and called him by the name we'd chosen and tried to figure out how to fix this. The next morning, a man in a hospital polo knocked and introduced himself as Franklin McCoy, the patient advocate. He'd gotten my information from the social worker and wanted to explain the birth certificate amendment process in detail. He sat down with a folder full of forms and walked me through each step. I'd need to file a petition with family court, show cause for the change, and prove the name wasn't my choice, which meant documenting all the pressure and the circumstances of Blake signing. He said cases involving medical emergencies and unilateral decisions sometimes qualified for expedited review, though he couldn't promise anything. Franklin pulled out a business card and said he'd worked before with a family law attorney named Margie McCoy, no relation despite the same last name, and I should call her as soon as I got discharged. He also offered to write an affidavit about the circumstances if it would help the case. I took the card and thanked him, feeling like maybe this wasn't completely hopeless. 2 days later, the hospital discharged me with a packet of postpartum care instructions and a follow-up appointment card that listed my son as Nimrod. Blake drove us home in silence, the car seat we'd installed months ago now holding a baby whose legal name we'd never agreed on. When we pulled up to the house, Blake's parents were standing on the front porch next to a giant banner that said, "Welcome home Nimrod" in blue letters with balloons attached. I didn't even get out of the car. I told Blake to take it down right now before we went inside. His mother started crying again, saying I was rejecting their family heritage, that they'd stayed up late making the banner. Blake looked between me and his parents for a long moment, then got out and started pulling the banner down. His father tried to stop him, but Blake kept going until the whole thing was wadded up on the porch. We carried Charlie inside while his parents stood there looking shocked, and I locked the door behind us. That first night home was awful. Charlie cried for hours, that newborn crying that sounds like the end of the world, and Blake and I could barely speak to each other. We moved around the house like strangers, passing the baby back and forth, heating bottles, changing diapers, not making eye contact. Around 3 in the morning, while I was walking Charlie around the living room trying to get him to sleep, Blake suggested maybe we could just use both names depending on the situation, like Nimrod for legal stuff but Charlie for everything else. I stopped walking and looked at him. I said that was exactly the kind of weak compromise that got us here, that our son deserved parents who would fight for him, not parents who caved every time things got hard. Blake didn't say anything else. He just took Charlie from me and kept walking circles around the coffee table while I went to lie down in our bed, wondering how we were going to survive this. The doorbell rang at 8 the next morning while I was trying to get Charlie to latch for feeding. Blake answered it, and I heard his father's voice in the living room, loud and formal like he was giving a business presentation. I wrapped Charlie in his blanket and walked out to find Blake's father standing there in a suit holding a leather folder. He didn't even look at the baby. He opened the folder and pulled out a stack of papers with the family trust letterhead across the top. He laid them on our coffee table and pointed to a section highlighted in yellow. The trust required a certified birth certificate proving the legal first name was Nimrod within 30 days of birth, or the beneficiary would be permanently excluded. He looked at Blake and said if we missed that deadline, not only would Charlie lose his inheritance, but Blake would be removed from the will entirely for failing to uphold the family obligation. Blake's face went white. His father picked up the papers, put them back in the folder, and set it on the table. Then he left without saying anything else. Blake stood there staring at the folder like it might explode. I went back to the nursery to finish feeding Charlie because I couldn't deal with Blake's panic on top of everything else. Later that afternoon, I was going through the hospital discharge papers looking for the pediatrician follow-up information when I found the pre-registration form I'd filled out during my 3rd trimester. I remembered filling it out clearly because I'd written Charles under planned baby name and felt happy seeing it in writing. But someone had crossed out Charles in different handwriting and written Nimrod above it in blue ink. My handwriting was black. I called the hospital records department and waited on hold for 15 minutes. The woman who answered said she was looking at the digital scan of the form, and yes, there were 2 different handwritings on it. I asked when the change was made, and she put me on hold again. When she came back, she said Blake's mother had submitted an updated form the day I went into labor with a note saying we'd changed our minds about the name. I hung up and just sat there holding the papers. Blake's mother had gone to the hospital while I was in labor and changed our paperwork. She'd planned this. They'd all planned this. Charlie's first week home was a blur of feeding every 2 hours and maybe sleeping 30 minutes at a time between crying sessions. I spent the tiny breaks when he actually slept researching name change laws on my phone. Every website said the same thing. You need to file a petition with the court. You need legal representation. You need to publish notice in the newspaper. The process takes months minimum. Some sites said it could take 6 months or longer depending on the court schedule. I felt trapped. Charlie was legally Nimrod, and fixing it meant months of court battles and thousands of dollars we didn't have. Blake kept trying to talk to me about his father's deadline, and I kept shutting him down because I couldn't think about the trust and the money and his family's threats while running on 2 hours of sleep and trying to keep a newborn alive. By the end of the week, I was so exhausted I could barely form sentences. Blake finally said we needed to talk to the lawyer Franklin had recommended. I was too tired to argue. Blake called Margie McCoy, and she had an opening that Friday afternoon. We drove to her office with Charlie in his car seat, and I felt like I was moving through mud. Margie's office was small and cluttered with file boxes, but she was straightforward and didn't waste time. She listened to the whole story without interrupting. Then she said birth certificate amendments based on lack of consent were legally viable in cases where one parent signed without the other's knowledge or agreement. She said we'd need strong documentation of the pressure campaign and proof that Blake's state of mind was compromised when he signed. She asked if we had any of that documentation saved. Blake and I looked at each other. I said we had months of text messages and emails from his family. Blake said his parents had made videos of the nursery they decorated. I mentioned the monogrammed items they'd bought and the custom crib. Margie started taking notes. She said she wanted copies of everything. Every text message, every email, every photo of items with Nimrod on them. She wanted a timeline of every family meeting and phone call where they pressured us. She specifically wanted documentation of the $200,000 contract offer and any evidence that Blake's parents had influenced the hospital paperwork. She said the altered pre-registration form was huge for our case. She also said we needed to be prepared for this to get ugly because Blake's family would fight back hard. I spent the entire 2nd week postpartum creating an evidence folder while trying to take care of Charlie. I went through my phone and screenshot every text message from Blake's parents and extended family. I downloaded every email. I took photos of all the monogrammed baby items they'd sent. Blake helped by writing out a detailed timeline of every family meeting and phone call where his parents had pressured us about the name. He sat at the kitchen table for hours writing everything down. When he was done, he handed me 12 pages of single-spaced text documenting months of harassment. I read through it and felt sick. Seeing it all written out in order made it clear how extreme their campaign had been. Blake read it over my shoulder, and I could tell he was realizing the same thing. He said he hadn't understood how bad it was when he was living through it day by day. Now looking at it all together, he could see his parents had basically run a psychological operation against us. We put everything in a folder and emailed copies to Margie. She called 2 days later and said we had a strong case. The documentation was thorough and the pattern of coercion was clear. But she warned us the process would cost several $1,000s in legal fees and court costs. She also said Blake's family would likely retaliate by making good on their threats to cut us off financially. Blake and I stayed up late that night having hard conversations about money. We looked at our bank account and our monthly expenses. We looked at my medical bills from the hemorrhage that were starting to arrive. We talked about whether we could actually afford this fight. Blake said maybe we should consider his parents' offer to just use both names. I reminded him that compromising now meant teaching our son that you cave when people pressure you hard enough. We decided to move forward with the legal case even though it scared us. Blake found a couples therapist named Eli Booth, who had availability the next week because I told him we couldn't do this alone, and our marriage was falling apart. The first session was tense. We sat on opposite ends of Eli's couch, and Blake immediately started defending his decision to sign the birth certificate. He said I didn't understand the pressure he was under or how scared he was that I might die. I said being scared didn't excuse betraying our agreement and signing papers that gave our son a name. I explicitly said I'd never accept. Eli had to interrupt us 3 times to redirect the conversation away from blame spirals. He said we needed to focus on moving forward instead of rehashing what already happened. He gave us homework to think about what we wanted our marriage to look like, and what values we wanted to build our family around. The second session the following week was different. Eli had us do an exercise about core values, and what we wanted Charlie to learn about family loyalty versus personal autonomy. He asked us to imagine Charlie at 18, asking why we made the choices we made. Blake started talking about wanting Charlie to know his parents fought for him, and suddenly he was crying. He said he realized he'd chosen his parents' approval over our partnership in the most important moment of our lives. He said he'd been so conditioned to please his family that he couldn't see how wrong it was until he thought about Charlie growing up and learning that his dad had caved under pressure. It was the first time since the birth that I felt like Blake actually understood what he'd done. I reached over and held his hand. Eli said this was progress and we needed to keep building on it. The pediatrician's office called during week 3 saying they needed to update their records with Charlie's legal name for insurance and vaccination records. I was holding Charlie while Blake stood next to me. The receptionist asked for the baby's full legal name and I had to say Nimrod out loud. Hearing myself say it to someone outside our immediate situation made everything feel real again, in a way that knocked the air out of my lungs. The receptionist repeated it back to confirm spelling and I could hear the confusion in her voice. I said yes, that's correct, and hung up. Then I just stood there holding Charlie and started sobbing. Blake took him from me and kept walking circles around the living room while I sat on the floor crying. All the progress we'd made in therapy felt meaningless because at the end of the day, our son's legal name was still Nimrod. And every official interaction was going to be this humiliating reminder that we'd lost control of the most basic parenting decision. That same afternoon, I posted a photo of Charlie sleeping in his bassinet on my personal social media page. I captioned it with 3 simple words and a heart emoji. Blake's Aunt Jennifer saw it within minutes and screenshot it to send to the family group chat. My phone started buzzing nonstop around dinner time. Blake picked it up from the coffee table and his face went white as he scrolled through message after message. His uncle demanded to know why we were disrespecting the family name. His cousin said we were spitting on 400 years of tradition. His aunt called us ungrateful and selfish. Blake's grandfather sent a voice message that was 2 minutes of him yelling about living a lie and dishonoring his legacy. Blake tried to respond in the chat explaining that we were working through things legally, but they just kept piling on. His mother sent crying emojis and said her heart was broken. His father typed in all caps that the name on the birth certificate was what mattered, and we needed to stop this charade immediately. I grabbed the phone from Blake and turned it off completely. We couldn't deal with this on top of everything else. 3 days later, Blake's parents showed up without warning. I was nursing Charlie in the living room when I heard a truck backing into our driveway. Blake went to the window and said it was his dad's pickup with something huge in the back covered by a tarp. His parents got out and started untying the straps. Blake opened the front door and stepped onto the porch. His father pulled back the tarp to reveal the custom crib with Nimrod carved into the headboard in giant letters. Blake told them they couldn't bring it inside. His mother started crying and saying they'd spent $3,000 on it and we were throwing their gift back in their faces. Blake's father said we were being spiteful and childish, wasting good furniture because we wanted to make a point. Blake stood in the doorway with his arms crossed and said we already had a crib and didn't need another one. His father said this was a family heirloom that should be passed down through generations. Blake said it had our son's wrong name on it, so it wasn't going in our house. They argued on the porch for 20 minutes while I sat inside listening to every word. Finally, Blake's father said they'd store it at their house until we came to our senses, and they loaded it back into the truck and left. Blake came inside shaking and sat down next to me without saying anything. The next morning, a large envelope arrived in our mailbox. Inside was a check for $200,000 made out to both of us. The memo line said, "For Nimrod's future, conditional acceptance of family tradition." There was a note from Blake's father explaining that the money was ours if we dropped the name change petition, and accepted that our son's legal name would remain as filed. Blake stared at the check for a long time. I called Margie immediately and told her what arrived. She said under no circumstances should we deposit or cash that check, because it could be used as evidence that we accepted their terms and agreed to the name arrangement. She told me to make copies for our records and put the original in the evidence folder with everything else we'd been documenting. I did exactly that while Blake watched. He asked if we were really going to turn down that much money, and I reminded him we'd already decided our son's identity wasn't for sale. He nodded, but I could see him doing math in his head about what that money could buy. That evening, I got a private message from Rod on social media. He apologized for not speaking up sooner and said he should have warned me how intense his parents would get about this. He admitted that being named Nimrod made his entire childhood miserable, and he spent years being bullied and having to explain his name to everyone he met. He said he went by Rod starting in middle school because he couldn't take it anymore, and even now at 38 years old, he still had to deal with people's reactions when they saw his legal name on documents. He said he wished someone had fought for him the way I was fighting for Charlie. He gave me contact information for Rachel Franco, a family mediator who helped him set boundaries with their parents when they tried to pressure him about naming his own daughters. He said Rachel understood the family dynamics and might be able to help us find some middle ground, though he wasn't sure middle ground was possible with a 400-year tradition at stake. He ended the message saying he'd support whatever we decided, and if we needed someone to testify about how the name affected him, he'd do it. I showed Blake the message, and for the first time since the birth, I saw him look relieved that someone in his family understood. Blake called Rachel Franco the next day and explained our situation. She had an opening the following week and said she'd be willing to facilitate a conversation between us and his parents if everyone agreed to participate. Blake was optimistic that maybe having a neutral third party would help his parents see reason. He said they were good people who just had this one blind spot about tradition, and maybe Rachel could help them understand our perspective. I was way less optimistic. I'd watched his parents spend months trying to bribe and manipulate us into using a name they knew we hated. I didn't think one mediation session was going to suddenly make them reasonable about something they'd spent 400 years building their family identity around. But I agreed to try because Blake needed to see for himself that his parents weren't going to compromise. The mediation session happened during week 4 at Rachel's office downtown. She had us all sit in a circle in comfortable chairs and explained the ground rules about respectful communication and listening without interrupting. Blake's mother started crying before Rachel even finished the introduction. His father sat with his arms crossed, looking angry. Rachel asked us each to explain our perspective, starting with Blake and me. Blake talked about wanting our son to have a normal name that wouldn't make him a target for bullying. I explained that I never consented to the name Nimrod, and woke up from a medical emergency to find my son's identity had been decided without me. Rachel asked Blake's parents to share their view. His father launched into the 400-year tradition speech and how the family trust was legally structured around the name. His mother sobbed about being the generation that broke the chain and how devastated the extended family was. Rachel tried to guide the conversation toward possible compromises. She suggested using Nimrod as a middle name, or finding a similar name that honored the tradition without the modern negative associations. Blake's parents shut down every suggestion immediately. His father said the trust documents specifically required the first name to be Nimrod, with that exact spelling. His mother said any variation would be the same as breaking the tradition entirely. Rachel asked if they understood how their pressure campaign had affected us, and if they could acknowledge that showing up with lawyers and money was inappropriate. They refused to admit they'd done anything wrong. His father said they were trying to preserve something important, and we were being stubborn for no good reason. The session ended with nothing resolved and Blake's mother still crying. Franklin McCoy called during week 4 to check how I was doing emotionally. He said he liked to follow up with patients who'd been through traumatic births to make sure they were getting support. I tried to hold it together on the phone but ended up breaking down and telling him everything. I explained about the family pressure that hadn't stopped, the legal costs we were facing to fix the birth certificate, and how exhausted I was from fighting this battle while trying to care for a newborn. Franklin listened to everything and then said he'd be willing to write an affidavit about the circumstances of Blake signing the birth certificate if it would help our case. He said he remembered the situation clearly because Blake's parents had been in the hallway making demands while I was in surgery, and he'd thought at the time that Blake looked pressured and overwhelmed. He said he could document the timeline and his observations as a hospital employee who witnessed part of what happened. I thanked him and said I'd ask Margie if an affidavit from him would strengthen our petition. Having someone outside the family willing to validate that something was wrong with how things went down made me feel less alone in this fight. I joined an online postpartum support group that week because I needed to talk to other new mothers who might understand what I was going through. Most of the posts were about normal stuff like breastfeeding problems and sleep schedules, but one woman shared a story about her husband's family pressuring them to use a traditional cultural name she didn't want. She'd been in a similar situation where her mother-in-law tried to name the baby while she was recovering from a C-section. The woman explained how she and her husband had gone through the legal process to change their daughter's name when she was 2 months old, and it had been worth every penny and every hour of stress. She said her daughter was 3 now and thriving with the name her parents chose together, and the extended family had eventually accepted it, once they realized the decision was final. Reading her story gave me hope that we could actually win this, and that Charlie wouldn't be stuck with Nimrod forever. I messaged her privately to ask about her lawyer and the court process, and she responded with detailed advice and encouragement. Knowing someone else had navigated this exact situation and come out okay made the path forward feel more possible. Blake's father called during week 5 with a new offer. He said he'd pay all my medical bills from the hemorrhage and emergency care if we'd just keep the name and stop making trouble. Blake took the call on speaker, and I listened to his father explain that the hospital bills were probably going to be tens of thousands of dollars, and we shouldn't have to carry that burden when the family could easily cover it. Blake looked at me with this desperate expression because he knew exactly how much we owed. The bills had been arriving all week, and we were looking at close to $40,000 in charges that our insurance only partially covered. Blake asked his father if this was another conditional payment, and his father said of course it was conditional on us dropping the name change petition. Blake started to say maybe we should consider it, but I cut him off. I reminded him we'd agreed before the mediation that our son's identity wasn't for sale at any price. I said it didn't matter if it was $40,000 or $400,000. We weren't going to let his parents buy the right to name our child. Blake told his father we couldn't accept the offer, and his father said we were being foolish and prideful. He hung up without saying goodbye. That night, Blake and I sat down together at the kitchen table with my laptop. I opened a blank email addressed to both his parents. I wrote out formal boundaries stating they could not visit or have any contact with Charlie until they agreed to respect and use the name we chose for him. I explained that we needed space from the pressure and manipulation, and until they could treat us as Charlie's parents with the right to make our own decisions, they wouldn't be part of his life. Blake read over what I'd written and added a paragraph about how much it hurt him to set these boundaries, but how necessary it was for our family's well-being. He said he loved his parents, but he loved his son more, and he needed them to understand that their behavior had damaged their relationship with us. We both signed our names at the bottom, and Blake hit send before either of us could second-guess it. Sitting there watching that email go out felt like the first time we'd actually been united, and on the same team since Charlie was born. Blake reached across the table and held my hand, and we just sat there together in the quiet kitchen, knowing we'd just declared war on his entire family, but feeling like we'd finally chosen the right side. Blake's father called the next morning before I'd even finished my first cup of coffee. Blake put him on speaker, and I listened to this cold, controlled voice lay out exactly what we were losing. He went through a list like he was reading off a legal document. The college fund they'd set up would be dissolved and the money returned to their estate. The down payment assistance they'd promised for a bigger house was gone. The emergency fund they'd established in case Blake lost his job would be closed. The trust Blake was supposed to inherit when they died would be modified to exclude him entirely. He said we had 1 week to reconsider our boundaries and accept that Charlie's legal name was Nimrod, or every single thing on that list would happen. Blake asked if there was any room for compromise, and his father said the only compromise was us accepting reality. The call ended, and Blake just sat there staring at his phone. I reminded him we'd already decided money didn't matter more than our son's identity, but I could see him doing the math in his head about what we were actually giving up. Margie called 2 days later to say she'd filed the petition to amend the birth certificate. She walked us through what happened next and explained there was this publication requirement where the name change petition had to be posted in the legal notices section of the local newspaper for 3 consecutive weeks. She said it was standard procedure for any name change to give interested parties a chance to object, but it meant Blake's entire extended family would definitely find out we were taking legal action. I asked if there was any way around the publication, and she said no, it was state law. Blake asked what would happen if his parents filed an objection, and Margie said they could, but their grounds would be weak since they weren't the legal parents. The publication would run starting next week, and the hearing would be scheduled about 6 weeks after that. Sitting in Margie's office processing the publication requirement made my stomach hurt. I told her I was scared of everyone knowing that Blake signed papers without my consent while I was unconscious. It felt like admitting publicly that my husband had betrayed me in the worst possible moment. Margie leaned forward and said transparency was actually better than trying to hide it. She explained that Blake's family would spin their own narrative if we stayed quiet, but if we controlled the story through the legal petition, we could present the facts on our terms. She said the petition would include Blake's statement about the pressure campaign and the circumstances of signing, which would make it clear this wasn't a simple disagreement, but a pattern of coercion. I looked at Blake and he nodded, saying we should be upfront about everything. We decided to let the publication happen and deal with whatever fallout came from his family seeing it in print. The annual family newsletter arrived during week 6 in a big manila envelope with Blake's parents' return address. I opened it thinking maybe it was some kind of apology or peace offering, but instead it was this glossy 8-page holiday newsletter they send to their entire extended family every year. The front page had a huge photo they'd taken at the hospital without asking, showing them holding Charlie with a caption that said, "Welcoming Nimrod 7 to the family legacy." Inside were multiple pages about baby Nimrod's arrival, and stories about the family tradition, and how proud they were to continue it for another generation. They'd included photos of the nursery they'd set up at their house with Nimrod's room painted on the door. They'd even printed out a section of the family tree showing Charlie listed as Nimrod 7 with his birth date. Seeing our son introduced to hundreds of relatives under the wrong name made me so mad I actually threw the newsletter across the room. Blake picked it up and read through it, and his hands were shaking. He pulled out his phone and called his mother right there. I could hear her voice on the other end sounding cheerful until Blake cut her off. He told her they had no right to use Charlie's photos without permission, and no right to announce him to the family using a name we didn't choose. He said if they sent any more newsletters or shared any more information about our son, we'd add harassment to the legal petition. His mother started crying and said they were just proud grandparents sharing their joy, but Blake hung up on her. Our third therapy session with Eli happened a few days after the newsletter incident. Eli asked Blake to talk about what it felt like being caught between his parents and me, and Blake spent 20 minutes trying to explain how he'd been raised to believe family loyalty meant putting the tradition first. He said his whole life he'd watched his brother suffer with the name, but nobody ever questioned whether the tradition was worth it. Eli asked what Blake wanted Charlie to learn about family, and Blake got quiet for a long time. Then Eli gave him homework to write a letter to Charlie explaining why we were fighting for his name. He said Blake needed to put into words what kind of father he wanted to be, and what values he wanted to teach our son. Blake looked uncomfortable but agreed to do it. Eli said the letter didn't have to be perfect. It just had to be honest about Blake's feelings and choices. Blake showed me the letter 3 days later. We were sitting on the couch after Charlie fell asleep, and Blake handed me 3 pages of notebook paper covered in his handwriting. The letter started with an apology for signing the birth certificate, and then went into this long explanation about family pressure and tradition. But the important part was near the end where Blake wrote that choosing Charlie's identity over family money was the right thing to do. He wrote about not wanting Charlie to grow up feeling like a pawn in someone else's tradition, or like his worth depended on carrying a name he didn't choose. He wrote about wanting to be the kind of father who protected his son, instead of sacrificing him to keep peace with grandparents. Reading it made me cry because it was the first time Blake had clearly said out loud that our son mattered more than his parents' approval. I told him the letter was exactly what Charlie needed to hear someday, and Blake said writing it had helped him see that we were doing the right thing, even when it was hard. The hospital billing department called during week 7 while I was feeding Charlie. The woman on the phone said she was calling to verify that I'd authorized Blake's parents to pay my medical bills from the emergency. I said I absolutely had not authorized that, and asked how they even had access to my account. She explained that they'd called with my insurance information and offered to pay the full balance, which was around $38,000 after insurance. She said they couldn't process the payment without my verbal consent, but wanted to confirm before declining it. I told her to decline it immediately, and to note in my file that I did not authorize any payments from anyone except me or Blake. She said she'd make the note and asked if I was sure because it was a substantial amount. I said I was completely sure and that the payment offer was part of a coercion campaign. After I hung up, I called Blake at work and told him what happened. He said his parents were using every possible angle to try to buy their way into controlling our decisions. Blake came home early that day and we sat down together to talk about money. He'd been looking at our budget and realized we needed to cancel our plans to buy a bigger house since we'd been counting on his parents' promised down payment help. He showed me the numbers and explained we could afford our current mortgage and basic expenses, but saving up for a down payment on our own would take years instead of months. I said I was okay staying in our small house if it meant keeping our values, and Blake said he was too. We talked about how every time we chose Charlie over money, the decision felt more solid. Blake said he'd been looking at freelance work he could do on weekends to build up savings faster, and I said I could go back to work part-time once I was cleared medically. We made a new budget based on just our income with no family help, and seeing it written out made the choice feel real and manageable. Margie called during week 7 asking for Blake's formal statement about the pressure campaign. She sent over a template with specific questions about his parents' behavior leading up to the birth, his mental state during my medical emergency, and who was present when he signed the birth certificate. Blake spent 2 nights writing and rewriting his statement, trying to get the wording right. He documented every family meeting where they'd pressured us, every phone call from relatives, every financial offer. He described how his parents had shown up at the hospital during my surgery and told him I might die, and he needed to honor the family tradition while he still could. He wrote about feeling paralyzed and terrified, and how his parents had handed him the paperwork already filled out. Watching him type out his family's manipulation in formal legal language was painful, because it made everything so clear and undeniable. When he finally sent the statement to Margie, he looked exhausted, but also relieved, like he'd finally admitted out loud what had really happened. Franklin McCoy emailed a few days later saying he'd completed his affidavit about the hospital circumstances. He attached a copy for our records and explained he'd documented how the pre-registration form had been altered without my knowledge, how Blake's parents had been present during my medical emergency, and how the birth certificate had been filed under unusual circumstances. He'd also included his professional opinion that the hospital's normal procedures hadn't been followed, and that there were legitimate questions about whether Blake's signature represented both parents' informed consent. Having someone from the hospital officially validate that something was wrong with how the birth certificate got filed made our case feel so much stronger. Margie called after receiving Franklin's affidavit and said it was exactly what she needed to argue that the birth certificate should be amended. She said between Blake's statement, Franklin's affidavit, and all our documentation of the pressure campaign, we had a solid case for the hearing. Blake's parents called during week 8 with what they said was their final offer. Blake answered on speaker, and his father explained they'd been thinking about a compromise where Nimrod stayed as the legal name, but we could use Charlie in daily life, and they'd wire the $200,000 that same day if we agreed. Blake looked at me across the kitchen table while his father kept talking about how this solved everything, and gave us the money without forcing us to use a name we didn't like in practice. I could see Blake was completely worn out from 2 months of fighting, the bags under his eyes darker than I'd ever seen them, and part of me understood the temptation to just take the money and end this. But I shook my head because we both knew what that compromise actually meant. Our son would spend his entire life explaining why his legal documents said one thing while everyone called him something else. Every time he applied for a job or got a passport or filled out official paperwork, he'd have to write Nimrod and then explain that's not actually what he goes by. Blake told his father we'd think about it and call back tomorrow, then hung up and put his head in his hands. We stayed up all night talking it through while Charlie slept in his bassinet next to the couch. Blake kept coming back to how much easier life would be with that money, how we could stop worrying about legal fees and afford a bigger place and actually have savings. I reminded him that Charlie would grow up feeling split between 2 identities, never fully owning either name, always having to justify the disconnect. Around 3 a.m, Blake finally said he didn't want our son spending his whole life explaining why his legal name didn't match what people called him. He said he'd rather Charlie have one clear identity that both his parents chose together, even if it meant losing the money and the inheritance. We decided together to call Blake's parents the next day, and refused the compromise offer, then told Margie to keep moving forward with the name change petition. Blake called his father that afternoon and said we weren't accepting any version of the name Nimrod, legal or otherwise, and his father hung up without saying another word. The family narrative war got worse during week 9 when Blake's parents started telling relatives we were keeping Charlie away from them and refusing to even discuss reasonable compromises. Blake's phone filled up with text messages from aunts and uncles saying we were being stubborn and destroying the family over just a name. His cousin sent a long message about how traditions matter, and we were disrespecting 400 years of family history because we thought we were better than everyone else. Blake's aunt called crying and said his parents were heartbroken and we were tearing the family apart for no good reason. The messages kept coming all week, sometimes a dozen in a single day, all saying basically the same thing about how we were wrong and selfish and needed to compromise. Blake started leaving his phone in another room because checking it just made him feel worse. But I read through all the messages and saved them in case Margie needed more evidence of the pressure campaign. None of the relatives seemed to care that we'd already tried compromising, and that Blake's parents had rejected every option except getting exactly what they wanted. They all acted like we were the unreasonable ones for not wanting our son legally named something that means idiot in modern usage. Our fourth therapy session with Eli focused on preparing for the likelihood that Blake's parents would actually follow through on cutting us off financially. Eli had us practice boundary scripts for when relatives called to guilt trip us, walking through exactly what we'd say and how we'd handle the pressure. He asked Blake to roleplay telling his father that we weren't changing our minds, and Blake stumbled over the words at first, but got stronger each time he practiced. Then Eli had us work through the financial reality of losing the inheritance and any family support. We listed out our actual income, our monthly expenses, what we could cut if we needed to, and how we'd handle emergencies without a family safety net. Seeing it all written out on paper made the consequences feel manageable instead of this terrifying unknown. We weren't going to be rich and we'd need to be careful with money, but we could absolutely survive on what we earned ourselves. Blake said something shifted for him during that session, when he realized we could actually make it work without his parents' money. The fear of being cut off had been this huge weight on him, but once we planned for it concretely, it stopped feeling like the end of the world. Margie called during week 9 saying the name change hearing was scheduled for week 10. She spent an hour on the phone preparing us for what to expect, explaining that the judge would want to hear directly from both of us about the circumstances around the birth certificate, and would review all the evidence we'd gathered over the past 2 months. She walked through the types of questions we'd likely face, and how to answer them clearly and factually, without getting emotional or defensive. She said she felt confident about our case based on Franklin's affidavit documenting the hospital circumstances and Blake's detailed statement about the pressure campaign. She explained that the judge's main concern would be whether the name change served Charlie's best interests, and our evidence showed a clear pattern of coercion that compromised Blake's ability to make a free choice. She told us to dress professionally, arrive early, and be prepared to spend most of the day at the courthouse because these hearings could run long. The hearing date felt both too soon and not soon enough after 2 months of fighting. Blake's parents hired their own attorney 3 days before the hearing. Their lawyer filed a formal response to our petition claiming we were trying to erase 400 years of family heritage and that Blake had full legal capacity when he signed the birth certificate. The response argued that the name change was frivolous and motivated by spite rather than Charlie's best interests. Their lawyer wrote that many families have traditional naming patterns and that continuing those traditions benefits children by connecting them to their heritage. The document claimed Blake's parents had simply offered financial support like any grandparents would, and that we were characterizing normal family involvement as coercion. It said Blake was a grown adult who made his own decision during a stressful time, and that we were now trying to undo that decision because we regretted it. Margie called after receiving their response and said none of their arguments surprised her. She said the claim about family heritage didn't override the evidence that Blake signed under duress, and their characterization of the pressure campaign as normal family involvement wouldn't hold up against our documentation. The hearing itself was more nerve-wracking than anything I'd ever experienced. We sat at a table in family court with Margie while Blake's parents sat across the aisle with their attorney. The judge was a woman in her 50s who looked tired and like she'd heard every family dispute imaginable. She started by asking me to explain what happened, and I had to testify about the hemorrhage and waking up 12 hours later to find my son named something I'd never agreed to. My voice shook when I described reading the birth certificate and realizing Blake had signed it while I was unconscious and possibly dying. The judge asked specific questions about our pre-birth agreement to name him Charlie, and whether Blake's parents knew about that agreement. I explained the months of pressure and the $200,000 contract offer, and how they'd shown up at the hospital during my medical emergency. Then Blake testified about his parents standing over him while I was in surgery, telling him I might not make it, and he needed to honor the family tradition while he still could. He described feeling paralyzed and terrified, and how his parents had handed him paperwork that was already filled out with Nimrod written in. His voice cracked when he talked about signing it because he thought I was dying, and couldn't think straight about anything except not losing me. Margie presented all our evidence in chronological order, starting with text messages from before the birth showing Blake's parents pressuring us about the name. She showed the judge the $200,000 contract with the lawyer's signature and the clause about being removed from the will if we didn't comply. She had photos of all the monogrammed items that arrived at our house before we'd agreed on any name, including the custom crib with Nimrod carved into it. She presented the altered hospital pre-registration form, showing where someone had crossed out Charles and written Nimrod in different handwriting. She showed emails from Blake's extended family all pushing us toward using the name and threatening consequences if we didn't. When everything was laid out chronologically like that, the pattern of pressure and coercion was completely undeniable. The judge looked through each piece of evidence carefully, asking questions about dates and who sent what message and when the various items had been purchased. Blake's testimony became the real turning point when Margie asked him directly whether he'd signed the birth certificate of his own free will. He said no, he'd signed it under duress, because his parents exploited his fear about losing me and made him believe he was honoring me by using their family name. He told the judge he wanted to be the kind of father who protects his son's identity, rather than sacrificing it for money and tradition. He said he'd made a terrible mistake in a moment of crisis, and he was asking the court to let him fix it, before Charlie was old enough to be hurt by it. I watched the judge's face while Blake spoke, and saw her expression shift from neutral to something that looked like understanding. She asked him whether his parents had known about our agreement to use the name Charlie, and Blake said yes, they'd known for months, and that's why they'd pressured him so hard when I couldn't stop them. The judge turned to Blake's parents' attorney and asked if there was any dispute about the pressure campaign or the contract offer. Their lawyer had to admit those facts were accurate, but argued they didn't invalidate Blake's signature because he was a competent adult who made his own choice. The judge asked whether Blake's parents acknowledged being present at the hospital during the medical emergency and influencing his decision, and their lawyer said his clients were simply supporting their son during a difficult time. The judge looked skeptical and asked if it was normal for grandparents to arrive at a hospital with pre-filled birth certificate paperwork during their daughter-in-law's emergency surgery. Their lawyer didn't have a good answer for that. The judge said she'd review all the evidence and issue a ruling within a week, then dismissed everyone. We walked out of the courthouse completely drained, and I had no idea which way the decision would go. Blake and I walked out through the courthouse doors into bright afternoon sun that made me squint after the fluorescent lighting inside. His parents were standing by the concrete stairs with their attorney, and Blake's mother took a step toward us with her hand reaching out. Their lawyer grabbed her elbow and pulled her back, saying something I couldn't hear from that distance. Blake's father just stared at us with his arms crossed. We walked past them to our car without saying anything. Blake drove us home, and neither of us spoke the entire 20-minute trip. I kept replaying the judge's face in my mind, trying to figure out what she was thinking when Blake testified. Charlie was with my mom, and when we got home, I just held him and tried to process what would happen next. The ruling came 6 days later on a Thursday morning. Blake brought in the mail, and there was a large envelope from the county court. His hands shook when he opened it. I read over his shoulder and saw the words "Birth Certificate Amendment Approved" right at the top of the first page. The judge's order said Blake's signature was obtained under circumstances that didn't reflect both parents' informed consent. She wrote that the child's best interest is served by having a name both parents chose together. The legal name was officially changed to Charles. I sat down on the kitchen floor and cried while Blake called Margie to tell her we won. Blake's father called 50 minutes after we opened the envelope. Blake put him on speaker, and his dad said they'd already spoken to their estate attorney that morning. We were officially removed from the family will and trust effective immediately. He said we made our choice and now we had to live with the consequences. Blake's voice stayed steady when he said we already made peace with that before we filed the petition. His father hung up without saying anything else. Blake looked at me and said he felt lighter than he had in months. The next few days turned into a blur of phone calls and paperwork. I called the pediatrician's office first and explained we had a court order changing Charlie's legal name. They needed a certified copy of the amended birth certificate, which meant going to the county records office and paying for official copies. I updated our insurance company, which required filling out a name change form and providing documentation. Blake handled getting a new social security card issued, which meant another set of forms and a trip to the federal building downtown. We went through our house and gathered every single item with Nimrod monogrammed on it. The blankets, the clothes, the toys, the custom burp cloths his mother had ordered. We loaded everything into garbage bags and drove to a donation center. Handing over those bags felt like reclaiming something that belonged to us. Each administrative update made Charlie feel more like ours and less like a trophy in someone else's tradition. Blake and I sat down at our kitchen table that weekend with our bank statements and bills spread out in front of us. We created a realistic budget based on what we actually earned without any family money. It meant staying in our current house for at least 5 more years instead of buying something bigger. We'd have to be more careful about spending and skip vacations for a while. Blake said he could pick up extra freelance design work on weekends to build up savings. We wouldn't have the trust fund or college money or down payment help, but the numbers showed it was totally doable. Everything would be earned by us and belong to us. Blake squeezed my hand and said this budget felt more honest than any version that included his parents' money. I opened my laptop that evening and drafted an email to Blake's extended family. I explained that Charlie's legal name was now Charles per court order, and any future relationship with him required respecting the name we chose. We stated clearly that we were open to visitation if they could accept our boundaries, but we wouldn't tolerate continued pressure or disrespect about the naming decision. Blake read it over and added a line about hoping they'd choose relationship over tradition. We sent it to 15 aunts, uncles, and cousins. 3 people responded saying they understood. The rest didn't reply at all. Rod called 2 days later to congratulate us. He said he'd been following the situation and was genuinely happy we won. Then he admitted something I wasn't expecting. He said he wished someone had stopped his parents decades ago before the tradition became this stuck in their identity. He told me he was planning to sit down with his daughters soon and tell them the truth about how the name affected him growing up. He said he was grateful Charlie wouldn't grow up carrying that burden, and that maybe our fight would help his parents realize what they'd done to him. His voice got thick when he said that last part. I thanked him for being the only person in Blake's family who validated what we were going through. Blake and I had our final therapy session with Eli the following week. Eli asked us to reflect on what we'd learned through this whole process. Blake talked about how fighting for Charlie's name taught him that protecting his son matters more than keeping peace with his parents. He said he'd spent his whole life trying to make his parents happy, and it took almost losing me to realize that was the wrong priority. He said he wanted to be the kind of father who puts his kid first, even when it's hard. I told Eli I felt like we'd finally rebuilt the trust that broke in the hospital. Blake reached over and held my hand while I said that. Eli smiled and said we'd done the hard work of becoming a real parenting team. He said most couples don't recover from the kind of betrayal we experienced, but we'd chosen to fight for our relationship along with fighting for Charlie's name. When we got home from therapy, Blake went to the craft store and bought a simple wooden frame. We found a print online that just said Charlie in nice blue letters and printed it at home. Blake hung it in the nursery right where the custom-carved crib was supposed to go. The whole thing cost $15 instead of $3,000. I stood there looking at it and told Blake it represented everything we fought for. Our son's right to an identity we chose together. His right to not be a chess piece in someone else's game. Blake put his arm around me and said this was the only thing that needed to be on that wall. Blake's mother sent an email the next morning. She wrote that she hoped someday we'd understand what we destroyed by breaking the family tradition. She said 400 years of heritage was gone because we were selfish. But then the last line said she'd always love her grandson regardless of his name. It wasn't an apology or acceptance of what we'd done. She didn't say she was wrong or that she understood our side, but it was the closest thing to peace we were likely to get from her. Blake read it and deleted it without responding. He said there was nothing left to say to them. We'd made our choice and they'd made theirs, and now we just had to move forward with the family we were building. We planned the gathering for the following Saturday once all the paperwork was filed and the stress finally lifted. I texted about 10 people who'd checked in on us during the worst of it, and told them we wanted to celebrate Charlie properly with the people who actually supported us. Blake cleaned the house while I fed Charlie and tried to make myself look less exhausted than I felt. Our friend Jess showed up first with 3 packs of diapers and a casserole that she said we could freeze for the really bad nights. Mike and Sarah brought formula and paper plates and said they remembered those first months being too hard to worry about dishes. Everyone who came through the door had something practical instead of cute, and nobody asked about Blake's family or the inheritance or any of it. They just wanted to meet Charlie and tell us they were proud we stuck to our choice. Blake's coworker brought meal prep containers filled with dinners for the week. My sister brought cleaning supplies and offered to come do laundry whenever we needed. It felt completely different from how Blake's family would have done it with the fancy gifts and the expectations and the strings attached to everything. These people showed up because they cared about us, not because of some tradition. I sat on the couch holding Charlie while everyone took turns meeting him, and Blake kept his arm around me the whole time. Someone asked what the middle name was, and Blake said we went with James after my grandfather. Nobody made a big deal out of it or acted like the name needed explanation. It was just our son's name, and that was enough. By the time everyone left, we had a freezer full of food and enough diapers to last a month, and this feeling that we'd built something real with people who actually mattered. 3 months after Charlie was born, we finally hit a rhythm that felt normal, even though normal meant being tired all the time and watching every dollar we spent. Blake picked up extra freelance projects on weekends to make up for the money we'd turned down. I went back to work part-time and we split the night feedings, so neither of us was completely dead. Our budget spreadsheet had every expense tracked because we couldn't afford to be careless anymore, but we made it work. We stayed in our small house instead of moving somewhere bigger. We bought generic brand everything at the grocery store. We canceled the streaming services we didn't really use and started cooking at home instead of ordering takeout. It wasn't the life Blake's parents had dangled in front of us with their money and their promises, but it was ours, and we'd chosen it together. Blake talked to Rod sometimes, but kept his parents blocked on everything. I didn't ask about the family stuff anymore, because there wasn't anything left to say about it. We'd made our choice, and they'd made theirs, and now we just lived with it. Charlie started sleeping longer stretches at night, and smiling when he saw us, and doing all the normal baby things that made the exhaustion worth it. Blake and I were better at talking through stuff now instead of letting it build up. The whole nightmare with his family taught us we had to be on the same team, or everything would fall apart. Some nights were still hard when the bills piled up, or Charlie wouldn't stop crying, or we were both too tired to function, but we got through them. It was Thursday night around 11 when I was doing the last feeding before bed, and I looked up at the simple frame on the nursery wall with Charlie's name in blue letters. He was almost asleep in my arms, making those little baby noises, and the house was quiet, except for the sound of Blake brushing his teeth in the bathroom. I thought about everything we'd lost by fighting for this name and everything we'd gained. We didn't have the inheritance or the trust fund or any relationship with Blake's parents. We had a tight budget and a small house and no financial safety net. But Charlie had the name we chose for him together. He'd grow up knowing his parents put him first, even when it cost us everything. He wouldn't spend his childhood being called something that made him a target, or made him feel like a piece in someone else's game. Blake came in and sat on the floor next to the rocking chair and put his hand on my knee. We didn't say anything, just sat there in the dark with our son who had the right name and knew he was wanted exactly as he was. The frame on the wall cost $15, but it meant more than any amount of money Blake's family could have given us. It meant we'd figured out what mattered and we'd fought for it and we'd won. That's it for today's story, and honestly, thank you for being here. You have no idea how much it means when people stick around till the end. I hope it gave you something good to carry into your day. Subscribe so we can keep sharing more moments like this.